The Dominion Coalition had perfected the art of cosmic bureaucracy over the course of 3 millennia, which was roughly equivalent to watching paint dry on 47 different worlds simultaneously. Their administrative prowess was so legendary that entire species had evolved better filing systems just to keep up with the paperwork required for basic existence within their territory. At the apex of this magnificent pyramid of interstellar tedium sat the apex lords themselves, crystalline beings whose idea of personality involved growing new geometric facets when they felt particularly emotional. They had transcended the need for individual names centuries ago, preferring to identify themselves through increasingly complex mathematical equations. The current prime calculator, a particularly sharp-edged specimen known as integration function 47.3 alpha, had been running galactic affairs with the sort of cold precision that made absolute zero seem like a cozy fireside chat. Below them, in descending order of what the Coalition generously termed evolutionary achievement, sprawled the remaining 46 species. The ethereal minds held second position through their impressive ability to think really hard about things, until those things exploded. Third came the biomechanical perfectionists, who had replaced every organic component of their bodies with superior mechanical alternatives, except for their egos, which remained disappointingly original. The hierarchy continued downward through various degrees of technological sophistication, psychic ability, and what the apex lords had clinically determined to be cosmic relevance. This system had worked flawlessly for 3,000 years, primarily because questioning it resulted in immediate reclassification to extinct species, which was notably less comfortable than even the bottom tier of the hierarchy. The Coalition's territory stretched across 17 spiral arms and encompassed roughly 12 million inhabited worlds, each one cataloged, categorized, and assigned its proper place in the grand scheme of galactic importance. New species were discovered with the regularity of a cosmic heartbeat, approximately every few decades. Some primitive civilization would stumble into faster-than-light travel and promptly find themselves face-to-face with a universe that had already been thoroughly organized without their input. The process never varied. Scouts would locate the newcomers, usually while they were still celebrating their first successful hyperspace jump with whatever passed for champagne in their particular biochemistry. A preliminary assessment team would arrive to evaluate their technological capabilities, psychic potential, and general usefulness to the Coalition's continued prosperity. Then came the Integration Council's formal invitation, which was about as optional as gravity and considerably less negotiable. Most species took their assigned position in the hierarchy with the sort of graceful acceptance that came from suddenly realizing they were very small fish in an impossibly vast ocean. The smart ones focused on climbing the ladder through technological advancement and helpful contributions to Coalition projects. The stubborn ones usually found themselves the subject of intensive cultural education programs, until they developed a more cooperative attitude, which brought the Coalition to their latest discovery, a small blue-green world in an unremarkable spiral arm, inhabited by bipedal mammals who had somehow managed to achieve interstellar travel despite an alarming tendency to solve problems by hitting them with increasingly sophisticated sticks. The preliminary reports had been illuminating. These humans, as they called themselves, had developed nuclear weapons before they invented proper interstellar communication protocol. They had somehow achieved spaceflight while still maintaining over 200 different governmental systems on a single planet. Most baffling of all, they had reached the Coalition's territory not through any breakthrough in physics or consciousness expansion, but by essentially strapping themselves to controlled explosions and pointing in the right direction. Integration function 47, pre-alpha, had processed these findings with the sort of mathematical precision that made quantum mechanics look like finger paint. The humans scored precisely 0 on psychic ability. Their technology was laughably primitive by Coalition standards, and their social organization suggested a species that had somehow achieved sentience by accident, and was still trying to figure out what to do about it. They would obviously slot in at position 47, dead last, just above the theoretical position 48, that was reserved for species too primitive to have discovered fire, assuming any such species still existed. The human delegation had arrived at Nexus Station 3 days ago, their primitive transport vessel docking with the sort of mechanical precision that suggested they were at least competent with basic engineering. The station itself was a monument to Coalition efficiency, a geometric impossibility of crystalline spires and flowing metal that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously, mostly to make visitors feel appropriately insignificant. The humans had emerged from their ship wearing what appeared to be their finest diplomatic attire, which by coalition standards looked like they had raided the costume department of a particularly unimaginative theater troupe. They moved with the careful gait of people who suspected they were walking into something significantly more complicated than they had anticipated, which demonstrated a level of situational awareness that was mildly promising. The lead negotiator, a middle-aged female with the sort of expression that suggested she found the universe personally amusing, had presented their credentials to the reception algorithms with polite efficiency. She had even managed to pronounce the formal greeting in passable Galactic standard, though her accent suggested someone who had learned the language from textbooks rather than through proper neural download protocol. Behind her, a small team of humans had spread out through the reception area with the sort of casual curiosity that immediately triggered every security protocol in the station. They examined the artwork, studied the architecture, and engaged the various alien species present in what appeared to be genuine conversation rather than the usual terrified silence that characterized most first contact situations. The Integration Council had scheduled their formal hearing for tomorrow, which would involve the standard presentation of coalition hierarchy, the assignment of their species' position and responsibilities, and the traditional oath of cooperation that every new member recited with varying degrees of enthusiasm. What the council had not anticipated was the way the human delegation had spent their first 3 days on the station. Instead of huddling together in overwhelmed confusion like most primitive species, they had somehow managed to strike up conversations with maintenance workers, food service personnel, and low-level administrative staff from dozens of different species. The humans asked questions, lots of questions. Questions about how the station operated, how different species had joined the coalition, what life was like for various members of the hierarchy, and whether anyone had ever tried to optimize certain obviously inefficient procedures. They asked these questions with the sort of innocent curiosity that made the answers seem obvious in hindsight, and with the kind of respectful attention that made even the lowest-ranking coalition members feel like their opinions actually mattered for once. Integration Function 47-3 Alpha had processed these reports with growing mathematical irritation. The humans were behaving according to no established first contact protocol. They were neither appropriately terrified nor properly submissive. They seemed to be treating their arrival at Nexus Station less like a judgment day, and more like the galaxy's most interesting field trip. Tomorrow's integration ceremony would resolve this anomaly. The humans would learn their place in the proper order of things, accept their assignments to resource extraction and basic labor duties, and settle into the comfortable routine that had maintained galactic stability for 3 millennia. After all, they had arrived with empty hands and primitive technology. What possible disruption could 47 newcomers cause to a system that had successfully managed 12 million worlds? The mathematical probability was so small as to be effectively zero, which, as Integration Function 47-3 Alpha would soon discover, was exactly the sort of calculation that the universe found hilarious. The Integration Council chamber existed in a state of architectural smugness that would have impressed even the most pretentious interior decorator in 17 different dimensions. Crystalline walls pulsed with soft bioluminescent displays, showing the current hierarchy of all 46 coalition species, while gravity fields subtly pressed downward on visitors to ensure they felt appropriately humbled before the proceedings even began. The council itself consisted of representatives from the top 15 species, each positioned according to their exact rank in the cosmic pecking order. Integration Function 47-3 Alpha occupied the highest platform, its crystalline form refracting the chamber's light into mathematical patterns that somehow managed to look condescending. Below it, the various council members arranged themselves in descending tiers, like a wedding cake designed by someone with a severe superiority complex. The human delegation had been escorted in by a pair of enforcement drones, sleek mechanical units, whose primary function was looking intimidating while performing basic crowd control. The humans had thanked the drones politely, which had caused a minor glitch in their behavioral programming since gratitude towards security personnel was not among their recognized prisoner responses. The lead human negotiator took her position at the speaker's platform with the sort of calm composure that suggested either remarkable diplomatic training or complete ignorance of how much trouble she was potentially in. Her team spread out behind her in a loose formation that looked casual, but allowed each member clear sightlines to different sections of the council chamber. Species designation: Human, Integration Function 4743 Alpha, announced, its voice carrying the harmonic resonance of crystal formations that had been tuned for maximum authority. Origin World: Earth, Sector 7043b, Minor Spiral Arm 12. You have requested integration into the Dominion Coalition. This council will determine your species' appropriate position and responsibilities within our unified structure. The human representative inclined her head respectfully. We appreciate the opportunity to contribute to galactic civilization. We understand that the coalition has maintained peace and prosperity for 3 millennia. Quite an impressive achievement. Several council members preened visibly at this acknowledgement, their various forms of smugness manifesting in biological displays, ranging from color changes to dimensional shifting. The ethereal mind representative expanded its psychic aura in what passed for pleased self-satisfaction among beings of pure consciousness. Indeed, rumbled the biomechanical perfectionist delegate, its enhanced vocal systems, adding unnecessary bass, harmonics for dramatic effect. The coalition's success stems from proper organization. Each species contributes according to their capabilities and cosmic significance. Fascinating, the human replied, pulling out a small electronic tablet. Primitive by coalition standards, but function. We've been studying your structure during our stay here. The efficiency is remarkable, though we did notice some interesting patterns in resource allocation and workflow distribution. New species were expected to listen and accept, not analyze and comment. Integration Function 47.3 Alpha processed this deviation with mathematical precision. Your observations are noted but irrelevant. The coalition's organizational structure has been optimized over 3 millennia. Your species will be assigned to Resource Extraction Division, Level 12, Basic Materials Processing and Waste Management. These duties are appropriate for your current technological and psychic capabilities. Of course, the human agreed readily, making a note on her tablet. Waste management is crucial to any large organization. We actually have considerable experience with recycling systems and resource optimization. During our journey here, we couldn't help but notice that several coalition worlds are experiencing efficiency bottlenecks in their processing network. The chamber's atmosphere grew noticeably cooler. The psychic manipulator representative, a writhing mass of tentacles that communicated through controlled electromagnetic pulses, sent out a wave of subtle irritation. Your species lacks the cognitive sophistication to analyze coalition operations. It pulsed dismissively. Resource extraction personnel do not engage in systems analysis. You will perform assigned tasks without deviation. The human smile never wavered. Absolutely. We're here to help however we can. Though I am curious about something, we met some fascinating individuals from the gravitational engineers during our stay. 42nd position in the hierarchy, if I recall correctly. They mentioned some innovative approaches to improving matter transport efficiency that could potentially boost productivity across multiple sectors. Integration Function 47.3 Alpha's crystalline structure flickered with what might have been surprise. Species in the 40th and below positions rarely spoke to newcomers, and they certainly never discussed technical innovations with primitive arrivals. The gravitational engineers are assigned to basic maintenance duties, the Apex Lord replied stiffly. Their suggestions are processed through appropriate channels. Oh, I'm sure they are, the human said cheerfully, though it did seem like some of their ideas had been in those channels for quite a while without implementation, decades in some cases. But I'm sure there are good reasons for the delay. The uncomfortable silence that followed was broken by the quantum consciousness representative, a being that existed as a probability cloud and communicated through reality fluctuations. Its manifestation wavered irritably. New species do not question coalition procedures. It stated through localized space-time distortions. You will accept assignment and report for duty orientation tomorrow. Certainly, the human replied. We're looking forward to working with all the species in resource extraction. From what we understand, that includes Let me see. She consulted her tablet again. Representatives from 31 different coalition members. From positions 15 through 46. Quite a diverse group. This observation landed with the subtlety of a collapsing star. The coalition's dirty secret was that roughly 2/3 of their membership was assigned to various forms of manual labor, while the top 15 species handled all decision-making, creative work, and technological development. It wasn't something they typically drew attention to during integration ceremonies. The coalition operates on principles of merit-based specialization. The biomechanical perfectionist explained. Its enhanced vocal processors, adding unnecessary emphasis to mask its discomfort. Advanced species handle advanced responsibilities. Makes perfect sense, the human agreed. Though it's interesting how much innovation seems to be bubbling up from the lower tiers. The mineral synthesizers, position 38, I believe, have developed some remarkable crystalline matrices that could revolutionize energy storage. The atmospheric processors have breakthrough techniques for terraforming optimization. Even the biowaste recyclers have created protein synthesis methods that could solve food distribution problems across 17 sectors. The chamber's temperatures seem to drop another few degrees. Integration function 47.3 alphas, mathematical processes, churned with increasing complexity as it processed the implications of this primitive species, somehow possessing detailed knowledge of innovations from across the coalition hierarchy. How did you acquire this information? The Apex Lord inquired, its crystalline voice carrying harmonic frequencies of suspicion. The human's expression remained pleasantly innocent. Oh, we're naturally curious about our future colleague. We spent the last few days getting to know various coalition members, sharing stories about our respective worlds and cultures. It's amazing what people will tell you when you actually listen to what they have to say. Another uncomfortable silence settled over the chamber. The concept of upper-tier species, listening to lower-tier perspectives, was so foreign to coalition culture that several council members were struggling to process it entirely. Your species will report to resource extraction tomorrow. Integration function 47. This concludes your integration hearing. You are dismissed. The human delegation rose with appropriate ceremony, bowing respectfully to the council before filing out of the chamber. As they reached the exit, the lead negotiator paused and turned back. Oh, one last thing, she said casually. We brought some technical documentation from Earth agricultural techniques, metallurgy processes, some basic engineering solutions we've developed. Nothing fancy by your standards, I'm sure, but we thought we'd make it available to anyone who might find it useful. We've uploaded it to the general access archives. With that, the humans departed, leaving behind a council chamber filled with the sort of silence that typically preceded either profound revelations or administrative disaster. Integration function 47.3 alpha began processing risk assessment calculations with increasing urgency. The humans had just offered to share their primitive technology freely with every coalition member, regardless of hierarchy position. This violated approximately 17 different organizational protocols and had the potential to disrupt established information control systems. More troubling still was the realization that these supposedly primitive mammals had somehow mapped the coalition's power structure, identified systemic inefficiencies, and established communication networks with species across multiple hierarchy tiers in less than 72 hours. The mathematical probability of this being coincidental was approaching zero, which meant the humans were either impossibly lucky, or they were playing a game with rules that the coalition didn't recognize yet. 6 months later, the Dominion Coalition discovered that humans possessed a talent for exceeding expectations in ways that made administrative oversight a living nightmare. What had begun as a routine assignment of primitive mammals to basic waste management had somehow evolved into a consulting operation that was making middle management aliens across 17 sectors extremely uncomfortable. The humans had approached their menial duties with the sort of methodical thoroughness that suggested either exceptional dedication to janitorial excellence or a completely different agenda altogether. They had not merely cleaned waste processing facilities, they had optimized them. They had not simply moved materials from point A to point B. They had redesigned the entire logistics network to eliminate 6 unnecessary intermediate stops. More disturbingly, they had done all of this while maintaining the most extensive informal communication network in coalition history. The human delegation had somehow established personal relationships with representatives from every single member species, from the lowliest bio-waste recyclers to the second-tier quantum mathematicians who handled complex calculations for the upper hierarchy. Integration Function 47.3 Alpha had been monitoring these developments with increasing mathematical anxiety. The humans were technically following their assigned duties to the letter, but they were doing so in ways that made the rigid hierarchy look increasingly arbitrary. When the gravitational engineers' efficiency improvements were finally implemented after gathering dust for 3 decades, productivity in 17 sectors increased by 37%. When the atmospheric processors' terraforming innovations were actually tested, they reduced planetary conversion time by half. The humans hadn't pushed for these implementations. They had simply made sure the right information reached the right decision-makers through their expanding network of interdisciplinary friendships, which brought the coalition to their current crisis, a cascade failure in the Nexus Station's primary energy distribution network that had begun 48 hours ago and was currently threatening to shut down administrative functions across 12 major sectors. The Apex Lords had applied their mathematical precision to the problem. The ethereal minds had focused their considerable psychic abilities on finding solutions. The biomechanical perfectionists had deployed their most advanced technological resources. None of their approaches had worked. The problem, as near as anyone could determine, involved a complex interaction between 17 different systems that had never been designed to work together. The station's original architects had built each component to interface with specific other components, creating a network of dependencies that made comprehensive repairs nearly impossible. Integration Function 47.3 Alpha had been running continuous calculations for 37 hours when the human delegation requested an audience. "We think we might be able to help," the lead negotiator announced, her expression carrying that same mildly amused confidence that had characterized their initial meeting. The Apex Lord's crystalline structure flickered with what might have been desperate hope, disguised as mathematical skepticism. "Your species lacks the technological sophistication to comprehend Nexus Station's energy matrices." "Probably true," the human agreed cheerfully. "But we've been talking to the various species who actually maintain these systems, and they have some interesting insights about what might be going wrong." She gestured to her team, and Integration Function 47.3 Alpha realized with growing alarm that the humans were not alone. Behind them stood representatives from 16 different coalition species, ranging from position 12 all the way down to position 45. They carried an assortment of tools, diagnostic equipment, and technical documentation that suggested they had been preparing for this moment. The gravitational engineers identified stress patterns in the primary conduits, one of the humans explained. The quantum stabilizers noticed frequency irregularities that correspond with power fluctuation. The energy distributors mapped the failure cascade, and the bioneural networks suggested an organic solution that could bridge the gap between incompatible system architectures. Integration Function 47.3 Alpha processed this information with increasing discomfort. "These species do not have authorization to collaborate on Tier 1 infrastructure. Well, technically they're all working on their individual assignments," the human replied with carefully maintained innocence. "It just happens that their assignments are all related to different aspects of the same problem, and they've been sharing their findings through informal professional discussion." The Apex Lord's mathematical functions began generating error messages as it attempted to find a procedural violation in species talking to each other about their work. "Besides," another human added, "the solution they've developed is really elegant. It doesn't require shutting down any existing systems or redesigning major components. It just involves coordinating the repair work so that each species handles the part they're best equipped for, in sequence, with proper timing. This violates established command hierarchy." Integration Function 47.3 Alpha stated, though its conviction algorithms were returning increasingly uncertain values. "Does it?" the lead human asked gently. "Because from what we can see, the command hierarchy issued an emergency directive to resolve the power crisis by any means necessary. The species here are volunteering to contribute their specialized expertise toward that goal. Isn't that exactly what the coalition is supposed to be about? The logic was flawless, which made it approximately 1,000 times more irritating than outright rebellion would have been. Integration function 47.3 alpha ran probability calculations on the proposed solution. The mathematical models suggested a 93% chance of success, which was significantly higher than any approach the upper-tier species had managed. Proceed, it finally announced, its harmonic frequency suggesting a being that had just made a decision it expected to regret. The next 6 hours provided a masterclass in coordinated efficiency that had never been seen in 3 millennia of coalition operations. Species that had never been permitted to work together moved through Nexus Station's infrastructure, like components of a perfectly synchronized machine. The gravitational engineers stabilized structural stress points while the energy distributors rerouted power flows. The quantum stabilizers maintained system coherence while the bioneural networks grew organic bridges between incompatible technology, and the humans moved between all of them, not directing or commanding, but facilitating communication and ensuring that each team knew exactly when and how their work connected with every other team's contribution. When Nexus Station's lights flickered back to full power, the assembled crowd of lower-tier species cheered with the sort of enthusiasm typically reserved for species discovering they had won galactic lotteries. Integration function 47.3 alpha watched the celebration with growing mathematical unease. The humans had just demonstrated that 31 coalition species working together could solve problems that the top 15 species couldn't handle individually. More troubling still, those 31 species were now looking at each other with expressions that suggested they were wondering why they had never worked together before. The humans, meanwhile, were congratulating everyone involved with the sort of genuine appreciation that made heroism feel like a team accomplishment rather than individual achievement. And integration function 47.3 alpha realized with the cold precision that only pure mathematics could provide, that the coalition's perfectly organized hierarchy had just experienced its first major structural crack. The collapse of the Dominion Coalition's 3,000-year hierarchy took approximately 72 hours to complete, which was roughly the same amount of time it had taken the humans to befriend half the galaxy during their first visit to Nexus Station. The symmetry would have been poetic if it hadn't been so thoroughly inconvenient for everyone who had built their careers on maintaining cosmic superiority. The crisis began when the energy distributor's humble position 39 in the official rankings submitted a formal request to continue their collaborative work with the gravitational engineer. This violated approximately 47 different protocols regarding interspecies cooperation, but it also happened to be the most sensible administrative decision anyone had made in centuries. Integration function 47.3 alpha had denied the request with mathematical precision, citing established hierarchy protocols. The energy distributors had responded by politely declining to process power distribution for sectors that didn't recognize their professional expertise. The gravitational engineers had supported their colleagues by refusing to perform structural maintenance on stations that discriminated against qualified species. Within hours, 23 different coalition species had joined what was either a coordinated labor strike or a sudden outbreak of professional self-respect, depending on one's perspective on galactic labor relations. The humans, naturally, had been horrified by this development and had immediately offered to mediate between the striking species and coalition management. They had approached this mediation with the same earnest helpfulness that had characterized all their previous interactions, which meant they spent most of their time listening to both sides and asking innocent questions about why certain policies exist. Questions like whether the psychic manipulators had ever actually tested their assumption that telepathic ability correlated with administrative competence, or whether the biomechanical perfectionists had data supporting their theory that organic components were inherently inferior to mechanical alternatives, or whether anyone had ever calculated the actual economic value that each species contributed to coalition operations. These questions had the unfortunate side effect of making 3 millennia of accepted wisdom sound remarkably arbitrary when examined closely. The Apex Lords had responded to the crisis with their traditional approach, mathematical analysis, followed by imperious declaration. Integration function 47.3 alpha had calculated the precise economic impact of the strike, and had announced that the rebelling species would be reclassified to even lower positions unless they returned to work immediately. This threat had worked perfectly for 3,000 years. It failed spectacularly when 31 species simultaneously announced that they were withdrawing from the coalition entirely and forming their own cooperative organization based on mutual respect and collaborative problem solving. The humans had accepted the invitation to join this new confederation with the sort of pleased surprise that suggested they had never anticipated such an outcome, despite having spent 8 months carefully cultivating exactly the relationships that made it possible. The newly formed Galactic Cooperative Alliance established its headquarters on a modest station in neutral space, with governance structure that rotated leadership responsibilities among all member species based on expertise rather than assumed superiority. Their first major policy decision was to offer full membership to any coalition species that wanted to join, including the former upper-tier members who were suddenly discovering what it felt like to manage 12 million worlds with a drastically reduced workforce. The ethereal minds had been the first to defect, explaining that they had always found pure consciousness rather limiting and were interested in exploring collaborative thinking with species who had different cognitive approaches. The quantum mathematicians had followed shortly after, citing professional interest in working with beings who approached problem solving from non-mathematical perspectives. Within 6 months, 43 of the original 47 coalition species had joined the Galactic Cooperative Alliance. The remaining 4 species, the Apex Lords and 3 others who had invested too heavily in crystalline superiority to adapt, found themselves managing an empire that consisted primarily of empty, administrative buildings and extremely complex filing systems. Integration Function 47.3 Alpha had spent considerable computational power analyzing how 47 primitive mammals with no advanced technology and 0 psychic abilities had managed to dismantle a 3,000-year-old galactic government through a combination of friendship, professional courtesy, and asking uncomfortable questions. The mathematical model suggested that humans had weaponized empathy, which was simultaneously the most ridiculous and most terrifying conclusion the Apex Lord had ever calculated. The final irony was not lost on observers throughout the galaxy. The species that had arrived with empty hands, no advanced weapons, no superior technology, no psychic dominance, had somehow acquired a crown of worlds through the simple revolutionary concept that everyone deserved to be listened to. The former bottom-tier species were now coordinating the largest peaceful civilization in galactic history, while the former masters of the universe were learning to operate waste recycling systems and discovering that manual labor was considerably more educational than they had assumed. And somewhere in the archives of Nexus Station, now operated by a cheerfully efficient consortium of 37 different species, a historical record noted that humanity's greatest contribution to galactic civilization had been the radical idea that cooperation was more effective than domination, which, as Integration Function 47.3 Alpha acknowledged in its final administrative report, had a mathematical probability of success that no one had bothered to calculate until it was far too late to prevent.